Hello, recording people. Okay, so we're just past the midpoint of the semester. Some of you will have started taking your midterms. Some of you haven't. Again, it's all optional. Let's do it midnight tonight. Last chance to email me questions about content or, like the logistics of it will be, the next few hours after class. Can't promise I'll be super responsive because I have some plans, but I'll have my phone with me, so I'll check that stuff as well as I can. Thank you all for taking the survey. I read the responses anonymously, but I gave you all points. I think I gave everybody points. I haven't looked at it since week and a half ago. So that, if there's anybody else who filled it in since then, I'll get your points too. But thanks for doing it. The feedback was really helpful. You guys have had good comments. It was kind of interesting what the comments were too, because they often contradicted themselves. Like half of the comments were, I want more time to talk and share. And then other half said, I want less time where there's talking and sharing. Which makes me think that it's kind of going well enough, right? The compromise makes everybody a little unhappy. So hopefully we're all just a little unhappy. And great. So what else was there? The lecture slides were liked. I'll try to involve some more student engagement. This lecture, probably not, but going ahead, I'll try to come up with fun stuff. It's hard to do when what we're doing is interpreting a text, right? It just requires going into the text and reading through it and understanding the form of the argument and what's being written, because it's not entirely on its face clear. And so we can do interpretive exercises in small groups, but I think the most effective way is just to hit it straight head on. So I'll apply myself to think of ways that we can get engaged together in conversation a little bit better. But yeah, like I said, I'll be available after class today if anybody has any questions. I'm going to get the slideshow going, and then we'll start a lecture on Camus. Okay, are you guys on Zoom seeing the presenter view, or are you seeing the actual PowerPoint?
The PowerPoint.
Okay, cool. Cool. All right, so the problem of suicide. The myth of Sisyphus is an essay. It's a series of small little essays, I suppose, each of which fit together in the whole to construct an argument that whose conclusion is that one ought not to kill themselves, right? So the problem of suicide is, as Camus says, the most important philosophical question, the first philosophical question, and that insofar as philosophers throughout the ages have been asking themselves and their colleagues, what is the universe made out of, and how does it all fit together? The big ontological, metaphysical, and even ethical questions. These all pale in comparison to that very first emotive existential question, which the existential philosophies deal with, which says, what do I do about living? Why ask any of those questions at all? Why get out of bed today? Why not just slip into empty nothingness? So that's the topic for today's lecture. And just this trigger warning is in order. There's a whole lot of talk of suicide and of I don't know. It's a tough topic, and so if that's an issue, it's totally okay to step away, chat with me over email later or whatever it is, and we can figure out something. But it's heavy stuff. So let's get into it. As he says at the very beginning of the novel, there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of all philosophy. All the rest comes afterwards. So the question is, what's the meaning of life? And why live at all? But why should these questions be the first ones that we ask, right? What motivates the importance of the problem of suicide? So Camus is saying that it's the most important one. Why does he think that it is the most important? Well, He mentions Galileo, kind of takes the guy to task. Galileo didn't expect the Spanish Inquisition. Nobody does. But Galileo is sort of the example here, because in the spirit of being inquisitioned, basically threatened with death for saying that the Earth revolves around the sun, Copernican revolution, he gave up his science pretty quick. His convictions about truth, capital T, how the world works, all of that sort of secondary to, oh, I don't want to be murdered for thinking what I do. So Camus jokingly says, I've never seen anyone die for the ontological argument. Now, if you're not familiar with the philosophy of religion, you probably don't know what the ontological argument is, which is too bad because it's a pretty funny joke. The ontological argument is, it comes to us from Anselm on the left there. Descartes also gives a version of it. And then contemporarily, Plantinga is a philosopher of religion and a logician who gives a cool, like, 5S, I think is the system, 5E. It might be 5E. I can't remember now. But like a modal logic proof for the existence of God. It's pretty fun. And it's totally valid proof too. But the ontological proof just says God is that being than which no greater can be conceived. I can conceive of that being, therefore God exists. And so that's kind of a tough way to think of the argument. So I've broken it down a little bit further here. God exists as an idea in the mind. A being that exists in the mind in reality is better than one that only exists in the mind. Thus, if God exists in the mind, then we can imagine something greater than God, that is a thing that exists in the mind and in reality. But as we've learned from premise one, God is that than which no greater can be conceived. Therefore, God exists not only in the mind, but also in reality. And this, it is, I think, stuff to say, but this might be my favorite argument in all of like the history of philosophy. It's so much fun. It's so like intuitive and strange, and you only need the 1 and 2 on the left there in order to get the conclusion that God exists. God is that than which no greater can be conceived, therefore God exists. And to so simply and elegantly prove like one of the most enigmatic and challenging concepts spiritually and existentially, I think is awesome. But it's also a little bit of a mental gymnastics doing the ontological proof. So when Camus says, I've never seen anyone die for the ontological proof, basically what he's saying is like, for any like theoretical reasoning, nobody has ever put their life down for that reasoning, especially Galileo, right? That, thinking what you do is very different from why you live the way that you live, or really at all. So what is suicide? But if it is hard to fix the precise instant, the subtle step when the mind opted for death, it is easier to deduce from the act itself the consequences it implies. In a sense, as in melodrama, killing yourself amounts to confessing. Suicide is a kind of confession. It is confessing that life is too much for you, or that you do not understand it. It is confessing that life is not worth the trouble. Dying voluntarily implies that you have recognized the ridiculous character of that habit, the absence of any profound reason for living, the insane character of daily agitation, and the uselessness of suffering. And if suicide is a kind of confession, a kind of like giving up, saying that life is not worth the trouble, there are, and Camus footnotes this, ways in which suicide can be honorable. So for instance, a political suicide, like instances of seppuku, killing yourself for the sake of honor, which I'm not sure if Camus would be totally on board with, but for the sake of like the greater good, you could imagine like Will Smith in I Am Legend in the movie, at least, he like gets the vaccine out, but it causes him to be killed. There's a kind of sense of suicide because he's willfully allowing himself to be killed, but doing it to save the world. So there's like honor in that. And then there's suicide from reflection, and this is really rare and problematic too. So Kirillov is the character from The Possessed or Demons, Dostoevsky's novel about communism, who commits suicide through reflection. Kirillov declares that his suicide will be the first willful one, the first true act of freedom, that in a world that lives inauthentically, in a world of people who are living for the sake of false idealisms, his suicide will stand as an example to everyone, to allow them to act freely without the need to falsely idealize. And the reason that this kind of reflection is able to do what it does, according to Dostoevsky, is that nobody's going to know about his suicide. So it's this weird, strange speech that Kirillov gives that seems to like liberate the whole world through a philosophical suicide, but then like nobody in the world will ever know about Kirillov. It's a strange passage. It's fascinating and awesome and like really powerful, but every time I look at it, it leaves me just in a whole lot of question. And similarly, that I can't remember the name of the author. He mentions the name of an author who kills himself in order that his works will become famous. And again, Camus jokingly says, "Well, nobody even really remembers the guy, anyways. So, whoops." But these are incredibly rare when genuine, and it's questionable whether they can be genuine ever. And it's not the target of Camus' essay. The target of his essay is the actual like suicide, the sort of suicide that comes from voluntarily implying the ridiculous habit of thinking that there's an absence of any profound reason for living, right? The giving up, the fundamental change that moves someone from a position of being able to live to wanting to willfully kill themselves, to say, I'm done with this, right? So the target of the essay is the suicide that's spurred on by the confession life is not worth the trouble. So, as says Camus, the subject of this essay is precisely the relationship between the absurd and suicide, the exact degree to which suicide is a solution to the absurd. So if Camus is going to describe the absurd, he's going to give us sort of the feeling of it, and then give us like inklings at a metaphysics of absurdity. But basically what he's doing at the outset of the argument is assuming the absurd, that is a premise number one, the world is absurd, and how that absurdity is to be understood or not is the like work of the first part of the essay that we read for today, the like first quarter of the book, I suppose.
May I ask a question? Oh, sorry.
And how the absurd inspires us to make this kind of confession that life is not worth the trouble. Camus' goal is going to be to overcome this kind of confession, to give us another way out of the problem of the absurd. What's up, Sarah? You're muted.
Well, I was just wondering, like in the Seventh Seal, if we were looking at that as like the Knight of Faith, he kind of did a self-sacrifice suicide, didn't he, to have more meaning in his life by sacrificing his eternal life from winning the chess game for the saving the family, maybe. But I was just thinking that that's not what he's talking about. Maybe the Knight of Faith would be capable of that kind of suicide, but maybe the Knight of Resignation might be, because he's all in touch with the absurd. Do you think?
I think the connection is there, whether you count Bloch's blunder of his queen as a kind of suicide, or if he always accepted the inevitability of death, then it's just a prolonging or giving up of some amount of time. But yeah, I think there's interesting connections between Bloch and Camus' absurd hero, and they might not always be the same. But let's.
Well, I guess what I was really wondering is that, like the Knight of Infinite Resignation, he'd be more capable of this kind of a suicide that involves the absurd, whereas the Knight of Faith might not, because he's a little bit more connected with the positive side. Is that correct? A little bit. I mean, that
maybe.
infinite resignation part has to be there to be real in touch with the absurd and the pointlessness, kind of.
So the person who infinitely resigns themselves to the world, if they don't take another step, they become nihilistic, which we'll talk about. And nihilism would lead you to suicide. So resignation is not enough to avoid the problem of suicide. It is a way to cope with the absurd, which the next step would be to give up on life. Now, the Knight of Faith is not going to be one that is not going to be an absurd hero for Camus, which we'll talk about at the end of the lecture. Okay,
Thanks. That's very interesting. Thank you.
sure. The absurd and its suicidal solution. So the problem then is, does absurdity require one to escape it through hope or suicide? Does the absurd dictate death? If the world is absurd, then must we die if we follow that absurd conclusion to its final end? Otherwise put, should I kill myself or have a cup of coffee? Right. This is the famous Camus quote. The idea being, is there any reason to do anything at all, even as something as simple as have a cup of coffee, or in the face of the absurdity of existence, am I committed to meaninglessness, emptiness, nihilism, and ultimately my own willful death? But what would lead someone to asking this question at all? Should I kill myself or have a cup of coffee? In facing the absurd, it's not clear how to answer any why question. Why have a cup of coffee? Why read a book? Why sit through this lecture, etc. And the first of these why questions is, why live at all? Why continue existence? But what is it about the absurd that breaks our ability to answer these why questions, specifically the one about living our life? And this is my favorite quote in the whole book. And yeah, maybe just like across Camus generally. I absolutely love this. So he says, great works are often born on a street corner or in a restaurant's revolving door. So it is with absurdity. The absurd world, more than others, derives its nobility from that abject birth. In certain situations, replying nothing when asked what one is thinking about may be pretense in a man. Those who are loved are well aware of this. But if the reply is sincere, if it symbolizes that odd state of soul in which the void becomes eloquent, in which the chain of daily gestures is broken, in which the heart vainly seeks the link that will connect it again, then it is, as it were, the first sign of absurdity. And if you guys have seen The Graduate, it's like that moment, right? They don't know each other at all, and yet they've committed, they've taken a leap of faith together, and in the final moment of the film, you see them both all of a sudden, in spite of the love and the faith that they had in this moment, like running out of the church and getting on the bus, oh wait, this is just as absurd as anything else. And they drift off with those 1,000-yard stares into the empty absurdity. What's on your mind? Nothing. And in that nothing, the void becomes eloquent. I love this expression, right? Because it is this hope, or if not a hope, then like a driving of the mind naturally by its own force, like water down a hill, to connect to propositions that can't be connected. And this is what the absurdity is. And it appears everywhere, in places as simple as a street corner or in a restaurant's revolving door. So the absurd is everywhere, and especially in the simple places. There's nowhere that escapes the absurd. It's every day at all times. It's everywhere in every place. And we can hope for the future, but this is a kind of forgetting of the present, right? And a turning away from the absurdity in it, meaning that I can say, look, the world is absurd now, but maybe in the future it'll be better. Right now, we've just run out of this church together and we don't know anything about one another, but I could smile again in thinking of what could be, right? But to think of what could be of the future is to turn away from the absurdity of the present and to eventually find it again, right? Is to have a hope or nostalgia, which again, we'll talk about in a moment, but a hope or nostalgia that distracts us, that turns us away from it. It's a leap away from the absurd, which is everywhere at all times in all places. There's no escaping it except through these leaps of irrationality. Okay, so the absurd is ubiquitous, but what is it? What is the absurd, right? Well, he says, perceiving that the world is dense, sensing to what a degree a stone is foreign and irreducible to us, with what intensity nature or a landscape can negate us. At the heart of all beauty lies something inhuman, And these hills, the softness of the sky, the outline of these trees, at this very minute lose the illusory meaning with which we had clothed them, henceforth more remote than a lost paradise. For a second, we ceased to understand it because for centuries we have understood it in solely the images and designs that we had attributed to it. Because henceforth we lack the power to make use of that artifice of concept. The world evades us because it becomes itself again. It withdraws at a distance from us. So this is an expression of the absurd, right? That when I look out at a landscape, what I'm doing is I'm seeing the hills and the trees and the systems of nature and the forms of reality sort of blanketed over the vista, right? But then I remember these are just concepts that I've been taught, that have been that I'm imposing on the world. The world is not identical with these concepts. The world is not what I think of as color. When I think of of red, I have an archetype or prototype of redness. And then when I say an object is red, I say it takes part in that concept, that it's similar to, but it's distinct from. And so these artifacts, these conceptual ideas, they separate, they become divorced from our understanding of the world. Or our understanding of the world, that is, divorces itself from the world. There's a breakdown, a failure to communicate, and we recognize this. And this is where the absurd begins to creep in. When we begin to wake up to the difference, the distinction between what our understanding captures and what actually is. So this is to say, in the first place, like of the absurd, that human experience of the world is contrived and artificial. But there are moments when we see through the artificiality to our private languages, that is like the idiosyncratic ways in which we understand the world, the private life lived in our own heads, that we can share on the assumption that there's like a common sense, or like common understanding of the way that each other works, right? Kant says this, that communication would be impossible unless we could assume in other people that they worked kind of like we do. But this is an assumption. And it's also an assumption of the world, that the world works in the way that we're making sense of it. So there's an artificiality to our inner experience of the world. Another expression of the absurd is a man talking on a telephone behind a glass partition. You cannot hear him, but you see his incomprehensible dumb show. You wonder why he is alive. This discomfort in the face of man's own humanity, this incalculable tumble before the image of what we are, is the absurd. And the image that's drawn to my mind is the person who's in the telephone booth, like year 2002, and trying to make some sort of financial trade, and like yelling and maybe holding a pencil and flapping about in their suit. And you can't hear any of the words, and you can see the emotion, but you can't feel it. It's something separate from it. It's as if like through a television screen, though like present to you in life right there. So our internal worlds, this like expression of feeling, this passion that we have about our own lives, we try to reach out and grasp that life of other people. We take what is in us, and just like we impose it on reality, we also impose it on other people. We try to make sense of the dumb show in the telephone booth of another person's life, but the telephone booth, like the body and the separation of brains, right, the problem of other minds, is an expression of this, that we can peer in, but do we actually ever hear the conversation that's going on? No, right? So we only see what lives on the outside. We are left to interpret and infer from the dumb show a majesty and meaning, a soul, right? Who this person is, what they're feeling, the power of it, the reason for its being expressed. That is from an existence for us, which is just that dumb show, that the waving about of arms and the unfeeling of that emotion, the inability to connect that expression to reason. And finally, the mind's, like another expression of the absurd, the mind's first step is to distinguish what is true from what is false. However, as soon as thought reflects on itself, what it first discovers is a contradiction. Whatever may be the plays on words and the acrobatics of logic, to understand is, above all, to unify. Understanding the world for man is reducing it to the human, stamping it with his seal. The cat's universe is not the universe of the anthill, another really cool expression. The truism all thought is anthropomorphic has no other meaning. Likewise, the mind that aims to understand reality can consider itself satisfied only by reducing it to terms of thought. And so this is to say that the entire strategy of conceptualizing, thinking about the world, making sense of it, constructing a reality for ourselves is again artificial. That the understanding attempts to reduce the world to what we are, to unify ourselves with it. But always the understanding is a step apart from the world. It's an object outside of it, peering down, gazing in, trying to make sense. And so reason hopes to unify the world in the understanding, but being human sets us apart from the world, making such a unity impossible. The world around us is infinitely diverse, and what does Camus say of like the history of science, that if a true history could be written, it would be a story of failure and impotence, right? Because every scientific theorem that's ever been proven or whatever has been proven false later on, given counterexample. Every author, I think I've mentioned the preface paradox in this class before, but the preface paradox is this idea, in case I haven't, that you have a book that contains an argument that says the world is this way. But in the preface, you say, I'm committed to this, but I'm sure that people will find things that are wrong with it. So you're committed to your view, and yet you express at the outset, I'm sure there are pieces that are wrong with it. Though in order to be committed to your view, you have to be committed to every part. And this is a kind of paradox. So similarly, we're committed to the world being the way it is for us, but we also recognize at once the impossibility of that vision of reality to be perfectly unified, perfectly consistent and coherent, to perfectly wrap itself around the world around us. And in this recognition, in this distinction between understanding and other, between understanding and world, between understanding and ourselves as well, the absurd creeps in. The world is more than human. It's separate from us. And we can only hope to unify it with ourselves and our understanding, but in the full light of reason, it will always remain aloof, because we will always have that like preface paradox. I think the world is this, but then that's just my own imposition, my own idealistic or conceptual imposition upon that world. So says Camus, I said that the world was absurd, but I was too hasty. This world in itself is not unreasonable, or is not reasonable. It is unreasonable. That is all that can be said. But what is absurd is the confrontation of this irrational and wild longing for clarity, whose call echoes in the human heart. The absurd depends on man just as much as on the world. For the moment, this is all that links them together. It binds them one to the other as only hatred can weld two creatures together, right? So the idea here is that that the world isn't absurd, and the human reality that we impose on it, on each other and on ourselves, isn't absurd. The absurdity is that creeping expression of impossibility that is only expressible in terms of a relation between understanding and object, right? That understanding tries to unify that which cannot be unified. Understanding tries to impose order on that which cannot be ordered. It tries to grasp that which cannot be grasped, right, in terms of self, world, and other. And so the absurd is this relation, this desire for meaning, this desire for unity, for understanding from a substratum of objects, others that cannot give it, that are disunified, non-unifiable, that are incommunicable. Right? This is where the absurd comes, in that relation between self and other. So the self dies and yet universalizes itself as immortal. It says, I am this, as if to say, 2 and 2 is 4. I am Spencer, right? That's a sort of universal claim. And I state it with all the power and strength and passion, which I might make any sort of other analytic a priori claim like 2 and 2 is 4, right? And yet I die. Death is inevitable. The other is private and only comprehensible through imposition. We infer others to be extensions of us. I understand you because I'm able to impose my own sense of self on you and then interpret the signs and symbols provided to me by you through what I know of myself. So at base, my sense of self gives rise to a sense of absurdity. My sense of other gives rise to a sense of absurdity. And even the world is irreducible to human reason, though we try in vain over and over to reduce it to us. Constant failure, maybe getting closer, but always gaps. The history of science and philosophy is one of failure to capture complete, indefatigable truth. There's no truth with a capital T, because there's always the absurd that creeps in between here and there. Okay, so what does one do in the face of this absurdity? If this is what the absurd is, if it's ever present, it's always there, what are we to do about it? Well, we can hope through nostalgia, right? We can nostalgically, nostalgia, I should mention, is a technical term for Camus that he doesn't define very well in the Myth of Sisyphus, which I don't understand, because that's like the first place where he uses the concept. He develops it pretty robustly in, I think it's The Rebel. The idea is just that nostalgia is that innate human desire, like I said earlier, like water running downhill. It's the mind attempting to unify, that this is like what the understanding does. It's how it works. It is what we are driven to do insofar as we are humans. That nostalgia is the desire for unity and a kind of hope that it can happen at all. And I think
that time-based? Is that like past and present? Nostalgia, is he talking about time, reflection on the past, unified with the present?
Yeah, so I think the reason he calls it nostalgia is because we look back on our experiences and are able to tell a narrative from them, and then it's this like the power of this narrative and its closeness to us and our human heart that inspires in us the like passion to unify. Although I don't remember exactly what he says. That might be a part of it. It is a common feature in all of Camus, that there's like a nostalgic element. Like Maman died today, and then at the end of the novel, he's like looking back and respecting Maman and always thinking of those times when she said that she could always find a reason to live. The mother character and the small, like the young Algerian boys running naked on the beach in the hot sun, like swimming, and just like Algeria in general are themes that have like really strong nostalgic vibes in all of his works, and I wonder what he would have said about nostalgia towards the end of his life, because it these images, these motifs do play really huge and important roles in his work. And here in the Myth of Sisyphus, nostalgia is almost a mistake, where in the novel setting, and especially in his later works, the nostalgic motifs take on a more dignified role in the character's understanding of the world. So just, interesting side note. That's what nostalgia is. So hope through nostalgia is one way to overcome the absurd. Like I said earlier, we can look towards the future. We can hope that, I don't have it now, but we'll get it later. You can hope for the future. But what Camus has assumed from the outset is that the absurd is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And even in the future, no matter how far we go, the absurd will always exist in the space between I and other, self and world. And if this is the case, if this is true, then hope won't do us any good. But this is one way to overcome the absurd, to just turn away from it, right? An alternative is nihilism. So rather than turn away to hope for possible unification, to impose some false narrative on the world, we can impose no narrative whatsoever. We can say, okay, whatever, that's it. The world is absurd, period, the end, right? So if life cannot be reconciled with existence, then willing nothingness may seem preferable to absurdity, confessing it's not worth the trouble, right? And these are the two options in the face of the absurd. And this is why, like, the problem of suicide is such an important problem for Camus, is that these seem to be the only options. There is nihilism and suicide, or there is hope and falsity, what he'll call philosophical suicide. We'll talk about that in just a second. And the goal of this book is to offer a middle way, a third way through, because he sees both of these answers as not great. So the next, well, here's what he says about it. At this point of his effort, man stands face to face with the irrational. He feels within him his longing for happiness and reason. This is nostalgia. The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. Another really cool expression. Just like Camus' authorship and writing is so friggin' sweet. I absolutely love it. This must not be forgotten. This must be clung on to because the whole consequence of life can depend on it. The irrational, the human nostalgia, and the absurd that is born of their encounter. These are the three characters of the drama that must necessarily end with all the logic of which an existence is capable. So here, Camus is giving us hope, sort of. He's saying, look, there's a third way through. There's a middle path. But before we get to that middle path, I want to examine the alternative, which is hope. Maybe like there are philosophical, idealistic conceptions of the world, strategies and methodologies for overcoming the absurd, which don't require this facing of the irrational, that allow us to forget the absurd, which would be through hope and nostalgia. And he calls these strategies philosophical suicide. So what did I say about this? Yeah, okay, good. So there are two kinds of suicide. There's physical suicide, right, which is a result of nihilism in the face of the absurd. And there's philosophical suicide. But why should clinging on to hope in the face of the absurd count as a kind of suicide? Well, what Camus says is that it's a betrayal of reason, that reason leads us to the absurd and thus becomes useless. But we can take a leap from that point, from the point at which reason becomes useless, and give up on the principles of reason and accept some new principle that allows us to turn away from the absurd. And this is to be inauthentic, disingenuous, and contradictory. It's a betrayal because it really makes any solution possible. So the struggle against the absurd implies a total absence of hope, which has nothing to do with despair, a continual rejection, which is not to be confused with renunciation, and a conscious dissatisfaction, which must not be compared with immature unrest. Everything that destroys, conjures away, or exercises these requirements ruins the absurd and devaluates the attitude that may then be proposed. The absurd only has meaning insofar as it is not agreed to. And this is going to be his third way. But what he's saying here is that by satisfying hope and nostalgia, by committing philosophical suicide, we make impossible the only attitude that could allow us to face the absurd and not fall into nihilism, to face the absurd and live in spite of it. So we get three examples of kinds of philosophical suicide. And he says, look, I'm not going to like deal with all of the different ways that we can conceptualize the world and methodologically like approach it. But here are three ways in which people have done so that are problematic so far as I see it. So Chestov is his first example. I haven't actually read any of Chestov, but he was a Russian, as far as I understand, was a Russian existentialist who who made universal conclusions about the absurd. He tried to unify the absurd, that if the absurd is ubiquitous and everywhere, then what if it's all just the same thing, right? What if the absurd is God? So when at the conclusion of Chestov's passionate analyses, he doesn't say that this is the absurd, the ubiquitous of that feeling, but rather this is God. We must rely on him even if he does not correspond to any of our rational categories. That is God. So what Chestov is doing is saying, look, the absurd is everywhere. And in like this Spinozist kind of way, assumes that the ubiquity of a God, that and this assumption, this inference requires a rational leap, a leap that is one of hope, nostalgia, and unjustified according to Camus. So the idea is that at the bottom of all inquiry, questioning, and discovery, there are further gaps. This is the absurd. The single unifying mystery of all is the absurd, but rather than call it absurd, Chestov calls this unification God. With this leap, Chestov attempts not to prove the absurd, but to dispel it. And Camus takes issue with this dispelling, to say that the absurd is unified, all powerful, something separate from, something in which we can feel sublime deference or whatever. This is to dispel that the discomfort, the problem that the absurd presents us with. And it's this problem upon which Camus is going to draw his solution to the problem of suicide. But if we dispel away the problem, then we dispel away the solution as well. So Camus argues that unifying the absurd so that every instance of it becomes a refraction of a single eternal and infinite entity that is God is a mistake. If there is an absurd, Camus says, it is in man's universe, not in God's. The moment the notion transforms itself into eternity's springboard, it ceases to be linked to human lucidity. Man integrates the absurd, and in that communion causes to disappear its essential character, which is opposition, laceration, and divorce. This leap is an escape. So the potency of the absurd, its power in our lives, the reason that it might draw us to conclude to willfully commit suicide is the lucidity of its contraposition to all of our efforts. In looking in the mirror, in looking at someone through the glass of a telephone booth, and looking at a landscape, it appears everywhere. So every human effort at unifying is individual, but still yields the absurd. And this shows that reason is useless. But for Chestov, there's something beyond reason, and that is the absurd unified, or God, a unification uncovered by the uselessness of reason. But to infer that something is beyond the uselessness of reason is to use reason at all, right? Is to say that, look, reason is useless, and so it cannot conclude, it cannot unify the absurd bits of the world. That's like to recognize the absurdity, to take the next step and say all of these instances of the absurd feeling, of the expression of absurdity through all of our attempts to comprehend it, to make reasonable, rational, and meaningful a world that cannot be, is an inference using reason. So we conclude that the world is absurd, and this allows us to infer that reason is useless. And then to take reason one step further and say, well, I can then rationally conclude that all of these instances of absurdity are the same thing, that they're not different contrapositions of understanding, but rather one unified contraposition. That's to reason circularly, to contradict yourself. Hence, Camus concludes to an absurd mind, reason is useless, and there's nothing beyond reason. So the idea here being that the uselessness of reason is revealed in the absurdity of all of our attempts to unify the world. And the absurd mind takes no extra step. It doesn't try to dispel this absurdity by unifying it. It doesn't try to take a step that it's not allowed to take, that it can't, without contradiction, take. It stands to its own principles and asserts its own uselessness. Whereas for Chestov, the unification, this like mystic mystery, this acceptance of the power of mystery for the sake of itself, is to contradict the reason that is only able to prove itself useless. So the next example is rather than like mystical unification of an absurd and calling that God, is a kind of religious God, right? The Christian one that we learned about in Fear and Trembling. So like Chestov, Kierkegaard also takes a leap. And now this term should really be familiar to us because we talked a lot about leaps of faith. For Kierkegaard, the leap of faith is an acceptance of the absurd. It's that like bringing the absurd into yourself, right? It's like one of the movements of faith, the first being the movement of resignation, and then you accept the absurd into yourself, and it's in accepting the absurd that you're able to conclude that through God all things are possible and have this transcendence of the ethical into the religious sort of life, right? We should remember this from our lecture on Kierkegaard. So maybe a leap of faith could be an acceptable answer in the face of the absurd, accepting it inwardly, but it's still going to be problematic because there's no logical certainty. In accepting the absurdity, we've shown that reason is useless. And so there's no certainty anywhere past the point of the absurd. The leap of faith moves beyond reason. And further, there's no experimental probability in such a leap either, which is to say that the leap of faith has no probabilistic guarantee of saving anyone. Bad things happen to good people and pretty often, right? That and good things happen to bad people too. I mean, the idea is that maybe the right way to deal with the absurd is to like bring it into us, but there's no logical certainty that we'll be saved. There's no logical certainty that through God all things are possible, and that our hand will be stayed from stabbing down through Isaac's breast. And then there's no experimental probability proving that such an acceptance is going to be good for us either. That in the history of the world, every time there was a binding of Isaac, it was stayed, but the Abraham's hand was stayed by an angel. That probability is not there. Every time that such an event occurred, it was probably actually the case that an angel didn't stay the hand, so says Camus, right? That Isaac ended up dead, right? Sacrificed, or I suppose lacking God, there's no sacrifice, there's only murder. So Camus says, if I do not draw negation from the absurd, at least I do not want to found anything incomprehensible, which is what Kierkegaard does. It is in virtue of the incomprehensibility of the absurd that through its acceptance, you can also conclude that through God all things are possible. And Camus is saying like, whoa. I can't do that. I recognize reason is useless, but it's my only tool. It's all I got. And if I take this leap, then I'm using reason to found some incomprehensible action, some incomprehensible stance, something beyond reason again. Camus wants to know whether he can live with what I know and with that alone, not through faith, not through some deep mystery, whether universal or particular, right? Universal in the case of everything is absurd, or particular in the case of through God, it is possible to stay my hand as I drive the knife down into Isaac's breast, right? A particular action. Camus is asking here not for some future knowledge or an incomprehensible epistemic stance, but rather with what is possible for the understanding to hold in itself alone. Is it possible to answer the problem of suicide, to say, no, I will not kill myself. I will live using what is accessible to us, what is within the human world. The proposition inspired by faith, through God all things are possible, right? This is Kierkegaard's quote, is contrary to reason and empirical validity. And so again, you can accept this proposition and give up on rationality, or otherwise accept it, but understanding its irrationality, not be deterred from the problem of suicide. So you can accept through God all things are possible, but the absurd still will have some grip, right? That if you don't abscond from reason entirely, then you can have faith, but the absurdity still presents that ineffable tension that the problem for all of the understandings attempts to unify. And then finally, Camus gives us the philosophical suicide of Husserl and the phenomenologists. And I think this is an attempt to make scientism problematic. So scientism is the idea that science gives us capital T truth, and through not through God all things are possible, but through science all things are possible, right? That there is one source of knowledge, truth, methodology, and purpose, and that is science. This is scientism. Nobody is really a scientist, not the right word, scientist. Nobody really accepts that proposition because there's a whole other world of experience that is non-scientific, which is the phenomenological. What Husserl tried to do was to connect the phenomenological, that of human experience, like what it's like to experience something, which can't be independently verified, which is not falsifiable, which is not subject to the scientific method, Husserl tried to unify that, what most of us probably interpret as a je ne sais of experience, in a scientific manner. So he was trying to like make a science of human experience. And he was the first phenomenologist, right? So his project was to make a science out of the inner workings and construction of human experience, that there's a psychological state or characteristic, there's a way that we think and that we represent and that we perceive and understand, and that we can find valid universal laws of nature, human nature, abstracted from the examples of human consciousness. So the phenomenologists, and especially Husserl, rely upon a particular view of perception. These days it's called representationalism. Camus calls it intentionalism. Intentionalism is like the European word, although it's used here too. I mean, they're used interchangeably. So, just so you know. And intentionalism doesn't have to do with like, I intend to do this. It is meant as a different word, consistent with representationalism, which is in perception that our perceptual experiences are as of things. We never have direct contact with the world, although representations can be like, some views of representationalism has it that representations are consistent with objects out in the world in themselves. But the idea is just that whatever appears in here is a representation of the world and not like a direct contact to the world itself.
It's this like the nominal essence idea that other philosophers have had. You don't get the actual essence of something, you get a nominal essence of it.
Yeah, sort of. So it's consistent. And what Husserl is going to do is say that these like nominal essences that we get, these representations, are participatory in like concrete objects, like concrete abstracts, like Platonic forms or something. But representationalism is just this view that the Camus invokes Bergson, who's like one of like the fathers of representationalism, says that vision is like the mapped image on a projector screen, right? That it's not the landscape itself, but the mind just sees like the projector screen, the light that appears there. It's a representation as of whatever the image is of. So if I am looking at my cup of coffee, I'm not seeing, strictly speaking, a cup of coffee out in the world. I'm representing in my mind, in my conscious experience, and attending to what I understand to be a coffee cup. That perception is inner rather than like directly connected, which would be a view called naive realism. That what we see is what's out there. So Camus is okay with this theory of perception. Consciousness represents features of the world which are unified under a rational pretense. And of this pretense is absurd, that attention unifies conscious experience. And so I say, here I see a PowerPoint slide, a picture of Husserl, a laptop, etc. But if I investigate, if I take reason to its final ends of these representations, I'll see that they too are absurd, that I'm imposing idealistic conceptions of reality, that the absurd feeling comes in no matter what. However, if what we represented was either in the world, naive realism, or otherwise consistent with some essential a priori mental constructs, in contemporary metaphysics, you might read about tropes, right? Tropes are things that exist out there and that are conscious representations, our imaginations of things are consistent with these tropes, and tropes are actual metaphysical entities that are out there that make it possible for us to say anything at all that's coherent about our mental imaginations. I think this view is insane, but it's out there. I think it's insane, but I say that without feeling confident in being able to provide any sort of alternative. It's really tough to explain how we can make valid claims and judgments about the experiences of imagination. Just, it's a huge philosophical problem, cool literature on it. Anyways, what Husserl is trying to do, right? Because he's trying to make a science of human experience. He's trying to deduce natural laws from the phenomenology of human experience. He's he posits these abstract entities that actually exist. And so when someone has an experience as of X, there is some abstract entity Y from which X is derived in conjunction with an experience of the world. And so one could assume, given for phenomenology, one could assume given any abstract object Y and experience of the world Z, that X, the human like experience as of, would be the result, right? The working result. And so we can begin to like find the ways in which the world and perceptions hook together and draw out science, right? Of how human experience works and then make predictions.
Could you just review that? If Y is the abstract object and Z is what? I just wanted to make that note.
Sorry.
Trying
So-
to follow
so-
this.
Yeah, so the in the example, Z is some object in itself, some object of the world. Y is an abstract entity, and X is our experience. So the idea would be to say for any abstract entity Y and object in itself, Z, that you could predict X would occur. And this is like the science of phenomenology. So like given the right components, we can predict what human experience will be. Simply enough put. And this was Husserl's goal, to make psychological predictions scientific rather than strictly like clinical, if that distinction is to be accepted. In order to do this sort of science, you would need to assume stable environmental factors upon which natural scientific laws could be derived, right? That given the interaction of these two factors, there will always be some result. This is how we make scientific predictions. But Camus again takes issue with this. There are no Platonic forms hidden away in us, or extra-temporal entities, as Husserl called them, through whom judgments about the nature of conscious representation might be independently verified. Science, and especially that of consciousness, attempts to abstract from experience to capital T truth. But if this abstraction from experience to essence, to extra-temporal entities or Platonic essences or some other thing out there that makes what we attend to coherent, actually coherent, that validifies these judgments, right? That says like what your experience is actually a correct, scientifically valid experience. This inference from experience to those entities is a leap in reasoning. Does that make sense? The abstraction, right, from experience to essence in order to make valid judgments about experience, that's a kind of leap, right? You're inferring something that reason doesn't actually have the right to infer. Cool. Okay, so just to sort of sum up where we're at, the arguments so far, the problem of the absurd, right? This is where the philosophical problem of suicide becomes an issue. One, humankind requires that the world be meaningful, which is our sense of nostalgia. But at bottom, the world is meaningless. The world is unreasonable. And this is troubling. That's the absurd. Argument one. Argument two, in the full light of the absurd, life is meaningless, right? This was the conclusion of the first argument there. Two, there's no reason to live a meaningless life, therefore suicide. Okay, this is the problem of the essay. Next argument, in the full light of the absurd, life is meaningless. Again, the conclusion of the first argument. There is no reason to live a meaningless life, of course, but if we turn away from the absurd, then maybe we can actually live a meaningful life. Maybe if we, all we have to do is posit abstract extra-temporal entities on the basis of our experience, and all of a sudden the absurd becomes less troubling. Maybe all we have to do is unify the great mystery of absurdity and infer from it the existence of a kind of monism, a godly theology, a mystical theology. Or maybe indeed all we need to do is take a leap of faith, to give up on reason, accept the absurd, and then make the claim that through God all things are possible. But as Camus has shown us, This is what he calls philosophical suicide. So it's not killing yourself physically, as nihilism would lead you to, but the hope and nostalgia drive us to philosophical suicide, to take a leap from reason, to step away from the uh, the modus operandi of our intelligence. Is there another way through the mess of the absurd? And the answer is going to be yes, through radical acceptance of it, but not in the way that Kierkegaard radically accepts the absurd. It's a radical acceptance through rebellion, right? Not accepting and submitting to, but rather remaining lucidly aware and rebelling against, always keeping it at arm's length. So, says Camus, this is like another super awesome quote. If I were a tree among trees, a cat among animals, this life would have a meaning, or rather this problem would not arise, for I should belong to this world. I should be this world, to which I am now opposed by my whole consciousness and my whole insistence upon familiarity. This ridiculous reason is what sets me in opposition to all creation. I cannot cross it out with the stroke of a pen. What I believe to be true, I must therefore preserve. What seems to me so obvious, even against me, I must support. And what constitutes the basis of that conflict, of that break between the world and my mind? But the awareness of it. If therefore I want to preserve it, I can through a constant awareness, ever revived, ever alert. And this is where we get absurd freedom or radical acceptance, our third way through. That the only genuine way, the only authentic way to deal with the absurd for Camus is to remain completely aware of it, to take no leaps, to stare it right in the face, to see that great abyss, ubiquitous and simple and silent, that void in front of us, and to not turn our eyes away, to face it head on. And to overcome the problem of suicide through that kind of awareness. So the first step is this lucid awareness, which we might remember Meursault at the end of The Stranger sort of having this, that throughout the novel he seems to be in a fog drifting through the events of the story, right? That he's almost like a visitor to the world rather than a participant, until the end, until he's condemned to death and he wakes up and feels the cool indifference of the world. This is him like becoming lucidly aware of the absurdity that's always been around him, that he's always had a sense of. He's always had the feeling of absurdity, and these are like the moments of heat that drive him to kill the Arab, to write the letter for Raymond, to not cry at his mother's funeral. That it finally, in the end, everything cools off. The heat goes away because he's no longer afraid. I think afraid is the wrong word to use, or maybe it's just that in his being condemned to death, he becomes able to stare straight on at the absurd. And it's in his staring and in his seeing, his complete awareness, that it becomes okay for him. He's able to rebel against it, to find a reason to live, just like Maman, to resign himself to the coming of the dawn, right, which would cause the bells to toll, and to only hope that there would be a crowd of people screaming in anger, waiting for his death. So, as Camus says, living is keeping the absurd alive. Unlike Eurydice, the absurd only dies when we turn away from it. So, does anybody know the story of Orpheus and Eurydice? Orpheus is the greatest poet, thespian, musician to have ever existed in Greek history, Greek mythology, and he doesn't pay much attention to his beautiful, lovely wife, though he loves her very much. And while she's away, she gets chased by a satyr, and then bitten by a snake and dies. And Orpheus, in madness and grief, plays his lute into Hades, like gets himself in, and strikes a deal and is able to say like, hey, let me bring Eurydice back to life because I love her so much. And the deal is that she can come back to the world of the living only if you don't look at her until you get back. So you must walk in front and she behind. And so Orpheus walks to the very edge of Hades, steps across the threshold, and in his excitement, he turns around, looks at her, disappears forever. Right? So living is keeping the absurd alive, unlike Eurydice. The absurd only dies when we turn away from it. It's the opposite. If you look away, then the absurd goes away. And suicide, actual suicide now, like the leap of philosophical suicide, is acceptance in the extreme. The absurd troubles us. There's nothing more troubling. And so Camus recommends don't accept it. Don't let it win. Revolt, rebel, stare deeply into it and live anyways, live in spite of it. Fight it. Keep it at arm's length, but don't lose sight of it. And so in the section Absurd Freedom, Camus says, okay, I've talked about why the absurd is problematic for us, why it inspires the problem of suicide. I've given an account of what the absurd is and how it affects us. I've also said why we can't turn away from the absurd, philosophical suicide, and all that's left to us is actual suicide, but is there another way? And in this section, he's giving us the other way. And there are 3 consequences of a full, complete lucidity and awareness of the absurd that construct a vision of the absurd hero, the absurd man, who I'll call the absurd hero, who doesn't cow to the absurd, and thus become a nihilist and kill themselves. So the first of these consequences of being fully lucidly aware of the absurd is that revolt gives life its value. Spread out over the whole length of a life, it restores its majesty to that life. Consciousness and revolt, these rejections, are the contrary of renunciation. It's not giving up, but fighting against. Everything that is indomitable and passionate in a human heart quickens them, on the contrary, with its own life. It is essential to die unreconciled and not of one's own free will. Suicide is repudiation, it's turning away. The absurd man can only drain everything to the bitter end. The absurd is his extreme tension, which he maintains constantly by solitary effort. For he knows that in that consciousness and in that day-to-day revolt, he gives proof to his only truth, which is defiance. And here, what I read in this is something kind of like Descartes' "I think, therefore I am." There is absurd, therefore I revolt. Something like that is going on here. And the movement is to say that the absurd is the basis, that the like ontological ground of everything. And this can, if we face this completely, then our only response to it is defiance. Our only response to it is to say, screw you, absurd. I don't accept you, though I am aware of you. And why defiance is the only response is not very clear, right, for Camus. In fact, this section is, he makes a bunch of kind of strange inferences that I think are born on the back of his own personal experience and thoughts, and not strictly argumentatively sound. I'm not sure he gives a valid argument in the Absurd Freedom section, though he does like construct a kind of argument. He is telling us here that in the face of the absurd, defiance and rebellion is the only answer that allows us to hold onto our reason without cowing to the absurd. Okay, so this is the first consequence. I'm gonna actually look at the chat real quick. It's just 6 messages. Does nostalgia imply idealized memories? So I think we talked about that a little bit. In defiance to the ubiquitous absurd, there's a life-affirming, life-owning experience rather than a nihilism level of discarding of all of it. Yeah, I think that's right. But what that life-owning experience consists in is the big question. What it means in defiance to have the passion quickened through the expression of human life, which he says in this quote here, is the question that's yet to be answered. All he's telling us now is that rebellion is the third way through, but we haven't characterized what that looks like or how it gets expressed yet. Okay. So if rebellion is the third way through, it's how we deal with the absurd while we're lucidly aware of it, not turning away from it, taking a leap, stepping aside from reason, contradicting ourselves, etc. How do we revolt against it? Well, we freely will to live in spite of it, that we look it head on and we say, I will live anyways. But what is freedom for the absurd hero? Something special. God doesn't give us freedom. Otherwise, God would not be all powerful, right? So this is the problem of evil, problem of paradox. Either we're not free and God has caused everything, but then you get the problem of evil because there's evil stuff in the world. Or alternatively, God has no causal bearing on the world because he's given us freedom, but then God's not all powerful because he's supposed to be all good to stop the evil from existing. He's impotent. And so Camus says that freedom is not any sort of robust metaphysical object to accompany what it is to be human. And this is because we're each slaves to life. We're all condemned to death. There's no great sense of freedom. There's no universalization of the will. There's no expression of action that is free from fading away, from being dust in the wind, just like all the rest of us. That we can do all we'll do, but in the end, it'll all be forgotten through the course of time. Freedom is used to permit actions for the sake of some end, where we're acting because we want something, or we'd like to see the world that way, or that there is a goal at the end of our actions, freely willed. But with death looming always, there's no ultimate end for action. That ends of our will are for the sake of their own ends, or for the sake of their own ends. That insofar as we express a voluntary will to act in a particular sort of way, it springs forth from that will springs forth a chain of reasons, ends for the sake of which that action will be caused. But that spring of reasons dies with us. It goes away, poof, gone. As soon as we're gone, so does that set of reasons. So the absurd enlightens me on this point. There is no future. Henceforth is the reason for my inner freedom. Freedom is a feeling for Camus. And though illusory, right, it's a sense. So it's an affective state rather than a metaphysically robust like power to do otherwise, or consistency of one's first and second order desires. These are popular definitions in the free will literature today. Freedom is a feeling, and though illusory, it's a valuable asset insofar as it enables liberation from an absurd fate through an acceptance of that absurd fate. And his Camus' comparison is, with the slaves of antiquity. The slaves of antiquity did not belong to themselves, right? They were slaves, but they knew that freedom, which consists in not feeling responsible, that they're not in charge. And this might be a callback to Seneca, who's a slave and a Stoic, famous philosopher. Death too has patrician hands, which while crushing also liberate. That in the acceptance of death and the absurdity, this feeling of freedom is possible through the facing of the absurd, rebelling against it and saying, I'm not responsible for the fact of the absurd. And yet I can still look it head on. I can still be liberated by my stance towards it. And whether or not I'm metaphysically free, I have a power to do otherwise, matters less than my absurd freedom in the illusion of, feeling like my actions are actually rebelling against the absurd, but what matters more than actual rebellion against the absurd is just that I'm aimed in that direction. So it seems from what Camus says.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
So for instance, with the Grand Inquisitor, the people who were following the Grand Inquisitor, would they have been, would they have qualified as having accepted their lack of freedom and being free?
Will you repeat the question?
Well, with the Grand Inquisitor, you were saying how the Grand Inquisitor took away the freedom of the people, so they got to have the relaxation of kind of being protected and not having that freedom. Would they have been experiencing this kind of existential freedom from the absurd that
No,
Kim was
no, no, no.
describing?
Yeah, those people, the like many millions who are like the grains of sand in the desert or the drops of water in the ocean, they're not facing the absurd. They don't have like this lucid awareness of it. In fact, it's because they cannot maintain something like a lucid awareness of the absurdity of existence that they submit their freedom to those few powerful people who can and do and who bear the suffering of the world, right? So the people in the Grand Inquisitor passage who are giving up their freedom aren't like the slaves of antiquity, like Seneca, who recognizes that he's a slave, and it's inspired by this experience as a slave that he says, all that I can control is my attitude towards the world. I can't control the things that happen to me. And so even though I'm a slave, that's okay, because inwardly nothing can touch that deep soul that is indifferent to all of the pain and suffering of the world that is forced upon me. So I can't control it, but I'm still able to be happy. And that kind of liberation is what Camus is getting at. And that kind of liberation requires an awareness of the state of slavery that one's in. For Seneca, it's actual slavery. For Camus here, it's death.
So that's kind of a difference between resignation and revolt. Like maybe the people in the Grand Inquisitor had resigned themselves to, they have no freedom. They're making that choice just to live, maybe just to get by, not to be slaughtered by the Grand Inquisitor as an unbeliever. But that's not the awareness of what Seneca is talking about. Like, I have no control over my circumstance, but I'm going to revolt and have control over my inner self.
Good. So there's one more step to be made, which is that there's a difference between renunciation and resignation. The people who give up their freedom, who like accept the three temptations or whatever in the Grand Inquisitor, renounce their freedom. They're not resigned to the world. They're not resigned to the absurd there. They are in a state of renunciation of their freedom. They're giving it up, right? To be resigned in the technical terms of the existentialist is something different from to renounce. And the difference again being in resignation, one is must be aware of the absurd, aware of the incomprehensibility of things at bottom. Whereas renunciation is, I'm not even gonna like look for things at bottom. I'm happy with surface level. Thank you very much.
That's super helpful. Thank you.
Cool. Okay, so the first consequence of a lucid awareness of the absurd is this inspiration for rebellion and defiance. The second is the illusory sort of absurd freedom that allows us to take a stance of defiance and willfully live it. So as Camus says, the absurd man thus catches sight of a burning and frigid, transparent and limited universe in which nothing is possible, but everything is given, beyond which all is collapse and nothingness. He can then decide to accept such universe and draw from his strength his refusal to hope and the unyielding evidence of a life without consolation. This is the experience of resignation and the kind of freedom, the liberation from the problematic nature of death and the absurd. That's what it's liberation from, right? And so in comparison to Marceau and the Stranger, the opening oneself up to the cool indifference, this sense of absurd freedom, that even though he's a condemned man and in prison, he still has the freedom to take this stance towards his lot, his fate, his world, his existence. And no matter what happens, even if it's a crowd of screaming, angry people calling for his death before the guillotine, he's not going to feel the heat of the sun in that moment anymore, because he refuses to hope for some other way of being. He's unyielding in the face of the evidence of a life without consolation. Marceau is not. He doesn't need to be affected by the passions around him. He's liberated from all of that in his lucidity and awareness of the absurd. And so whatever happens, even in the worst case, which would be people screaming for his death, things are going to be all right. He can remain indifferent to them, resigned, and in rebellion to these people, unaffected by them. Okay. So Camus says we ought to live in rebellion against the absurd in order to fully be your true self. Accept the absurd and be liberated from the tension that it incurs. But what does this life look like, right? What is the life of someone who is rebelling against the absurd and feels this like cool indifference, the liberation from the problematic of death and suicide, etc., through a lucid awareness of the absurd? What does that life look like, and how can it be meaningful, right? After all, meaninglessness was the problem that inspired the problem of suicide. That if the world's absurd, then the world is one that is devoid of meaning, or can't be ascribed meaning rationally, not without taking a leap. And this is what leads us to possible nihilism. So if meaningless lives are not worth living, then what gives life meaning, or how can we live in a way that avoids the problem of a meaningless life not being worth living? What gives the life of Camus' absurd hero its vigor and spirit, its reason to continue on, its raison d'etre, right? It's like sole purpose, passion. And this is the third consequence. And again, as I said, this section, he's saying a lot of stuff without making really clear inferences from premises. So when he says that we ought to live a quantity of experiences, I think this is questionable. In fact, Simone de Beauvoir, who we'll read in a few weeks, is going to take issue with this. She sort of tongue-in-cheek takes Camus' adventurer and adventurer character, the archetype, and roasts him a bit. Because I think this is a little bit strange, that in the quantity of experiences, ethics and value don't matter. And this is, again, it's a strange, like early Camus, distinct from later Camus, because there is like a quality and value in these nostalgic elements and motifs, like the innocence of children and the love between a mother and son and this sort of stuff. These are quality experiences rather than quantity experiences. You don't need to experience much of a love between mother and child for that to be, worth quite a lot, right?
Doesn't he equate them as well, though? Like he says that through quantity.
Yeah. So he, in the footnote, he does say that quantity of experience is not always inconsistent with a. Did I say quality? Quantity of experience is not always inconsistent with a quality of experience. And again, he doesn't give an argument for this. He just says it, which is sort of the motif of this section. Anyways, Passion is the third consequence of facing the absurd lucidly, fully aware. And what passion inspires us to do, so says Camus, is live as much life as we can. That in rebellion against the absurd, which would tell us that life is meaningless and not worth living, that we say, screw you, absurd. I will live as much as I possibly can. I will go on over and over and over again, never losing sight of you and always putting my middle finger up to you as I continue to live through the world in spite of you. So again, how exactly this works is unclear, but at least at this point. But the idea is that what's left in the lucid acceptance of and rebellion against the absurd is your passion, who you are. And in Schopenhauer's Educator, we might interpret it, it's not too much of a leap to say so, that this kind of passion that inspires us to be who we are in rebellion against the absurd might be that sort of thing that Nietzsche calls the principle that you find by looking back on all of the events in your life and finding that thing that's shared by all of them that made you happy, and then letting that be the principle of your life henceforth, right? We might think of this as a similar sort of theme inspired by the absurd hero living in lucid awareness of the absurd. And living in the light of that spirit of passion is the third consequence. Thus, I draw from the absurd 3 consequences, which are my revolt, my freedom, and my passion. By the mere activity of consciousness, I transform into a rule of life what was an invitation to death, and I refuse suicide. What the life of an absurd hero looks like and how, in light of these 3 consequences, they're able to live is dealt with in the second half of the book. So in the second half of the book, what Camus will do and what we'll talk about next week is he gives us a bunch of different characters who live in this way, in full lucid awareness of the absurd, who rebel against it, and what their lives look like. So to give us sort of like a human example, or human examples, conceptions of ways in which this project, the rejection of suicide, but the acceptance of absurdity at the same time, can be lived. And then there's another issue too, which is how do you create? How do you do anything at all? Why? So that in ethics, there's this question like, why be moral, right? In existentialism, it might be why be, period. And even if one faces the absurd, what can be those like principles that drive us forward, and how do those principles get grip in our active lives? And so he talks about creativity too. But I'm curious, what do you guys think? So now we're at the end. We've like gone through the construction of the problem, the construction of a solution. We don't have examples of it yet, but do we think that this is a way forward? That this is like, should we still kill ourselves, or are we convinced that we can go have a cup of coffee?
I wonder if this book has made some or not consider suicide more after reading this book than before, because I think it really illustrates absurdity and meaninglessness and all the things that we try to avoid looking straight in the face.
Yeah. Yeah. So Corner's comment was just that the sort of slap in your face of the problem that absurdity presents for us could cause us to think, oh shit, maybe I don't really have reason to be alive, and that could be a problem. And yeah, I hope not.
Poetry is what makes those like moments really lucid when he talks about the absurd, and then that's also his weakness when he goes on to make his argument is how poetic he is. So
Yeah, because it's not always incredibly clear how he's inferring from one point to the other. And if reason is the whole like force de jure of the response to the absurd, but then he's not being like the most carefully rational arguer, philosopher,
Right.
if he can even be considered a philosopher in this book. Yeah, it's a little questionable. So my response to Corna is that I think Camus says this somewhere, that it's like incredibly hard to do. It takes all sorts of energy to deplete yourself in the face of the absurd, and that I think it just goes without saying that not all of us are strong enough to do it. I constantly turn away, right? I think we all do. Like, we're all weak and we all take leaps. And even though like these leaps are philosophical suicide, I don't think that they condemn us, right? You know, you gotta have some self-care days, you know, where you stop thinking about the absurdity of things. That's important too. And these moments, these little reprieves, I think are important, just so long as they don't become universal, but at least within the scope of Camus, as long as they don't, those leaps don't become universalized as like forms of life, as long as we're always returning back to the project of rebellion for Camus to be right here. So he doesn't say that, which would be an easy way out. And he doesn't emphasize much how hard it is to to be an absurd hero, right? And so he calls it the absurd man. I call it the absurd hero for a couple of reasons. Gender equality is one thing, but I think hero is a more apt term for this sort of person, because they are incredibly heroic, right? They're the sort of person you might write an epic about. The same way that Kierkegaard reveres Abraham and said, if a knight of faith were out there, I would follow him around and do everything that that knight of faith did. I think that we should say the same of the absurd hero within the scope of Camus' argument, right? That this sort of person is able to remain perfectly lucidly aware of the absurd, live in full rebellion of it, and willfully deplete themselves in the face of it, is a wildly powerful person. Like would be an incredible sort, superhuman almost. Maybe, well, superhuman in the sense of being more human than anybody else could possibly be human. Anybody else being, you know, the many of us who take little leaps here and there. Yeah, I hope it hasn't been terribly disturbing, because that would be not great. Scott.
Hey, so I was thinking about this and wondering about the specificity of the rebellion concept. You know, because you mentioned how he maybe doesn't make the argument how that's the only valid response to the absurd. And there's this concept in professional wrestling called kayfabe. I don't know how many people here are familiar with worldwide wrestling or WWE or any of that stuff, but kayfabe is deeply silly and also a philosophical concept that I value a lot. It is the acknowledgement that the fact that you're watching The Undertaker wrestle with John Cena and knowing how silly and ridiculous it is, but believing it anyway, being invested in it anyway. And I was thinking about that in comparison with this, and wondering, you know, if someone looks at the world, acknowledges the absurdity, and decides to do X anyway, is that inherently a form of rebellion? Is that an alternative response to absurdity that isn't rebellion? You know, can someone, for example, say, I know that the universe is absurd, but I'm going to be the most normal, Christian anyway. I know that there's no proof for God. God probably doesn't exist. If he does, this universe is so absurd. I totally acknowledge that, but I'm still going to be, go to church every Sunday and sing hymns and feel it while I'm doing it.
Yeah, good. So first off, would you type the concept in the chat so that we could like all Wikipedia it later? And I think the way I would answer if I were Camus is, what's making the noise there? Is that yeah, you could do that, and we'll see in the examples he gives next week the lives lived in light of the absurd that are kind of like that. Although there are some conditions. So one condition is like in response to the Kierkegaard philosophical suicide thing, is that you are not you're not accepting the absurdity and then some other incomprehensible principle as like a way of living, that it's just the absurd that inspires the form of life that follows. It's not some extra principle inferred or created or whatever, right? That like the through God all things are possible idea. You might say that, yeah, I accept the ubiquitousness of absurdity, and yet I'm going to act like the most normal person that ever existed. If it's for the sake, you're acting as the most normal person is for the sake of acting as the most normal person, and not for the sake of rebelling against the absurdity, then that is a kind of turning away. It's a leap. It's at least an incomprehensible raison d'etre, right? It's an incomprehensible, unavailable to the understanding, contradictory perhaps, but almost certainly absurd. Who knows why reason to be. Okay, Fabe, cool. So that's one way that that could be a mistake. The way in which it could be consistent with what Kim is saying is as long as your passion, right, is to be the most normal person, and that insofar as the way that you express rebellion against absurdity is to be that person, right? To say, look, the world is insane and crazy, and so my middle fingers are highest and most powerful when they're pointed from the opposite direction, meaning that I need to be as normal as I can possibly be. I think that would be consistent with what Camus is saying here. But what comes first, what's like essential to living authentically and in like in a way that isn't contradictory to reason and the intelligence, is that for Camus, you are lucidly aware of the absurd, you rebel against it. This rebellion inspires a liberation to experience or deplete yourself consistent with your passion. And if your passion and rebellion is dignified by being super normal or by going to church and singing hymns, then great. Quentin?
Yeah, so just in the same vein, I feel like it kind of begs the question of whether or not, rebellion and passion and freedom, if they are necessarily an active thing or if they can be a passive thing. Just because they feel so active to me. Like it feels like you have to make a choice to do it, at least when you hear about it. So I just somehow like that just rubbed me wrong, saying that by being a normal person that you can rebel. I don't know. But in the same vein, I wanted to ask what do you think Camus would think about just forgetting about the absurd. Like, obviously, we talk about its ubiquitousness, but honestly, there's days that go by sometimes where I'm like, oh, I didn't think about the goddamn absurd today. You know, that's not a bad day. I don't know if that's a form of rebellion at all, but it does, like, obviously there's nothing active there because there's no lucid presence of the absurd, but it seems like a revolt in its own way, living your life passionately. I don't know.
Yeah. The forgetting the absurd, it's an interesting point. I think what Camus would say, and he says this a couple times in the novel in a few different ways, is that once you've determined the truth of a thing, you can't give it up, right? That reason leads us to these conclusions. In fact, to the conclusion eventually in the absurd and the uselessness of reason eventually. But along the way, there are certain truths like 2 and 2 is 4 or whatever. And as soon as that's there, it's indefatigable. You can't get rid of it. And if you forget it, then you'll come back to that anyways. And this is part of the reason that like taking a leap is a kind of philosophical suicide, as Camus says, is because what you're doing is you're saying reason has concluded this, but let's forget that. You can't ever really forget it, so says Camus. It's always there, and so there's like this inauthenticity, a bit of bad faith, sort of at play always. I'm not sure that forgetting every once in a while is a problem. It's probably a good thing. Again, it's like sort of the self-care days that Camus doesn't talk about. But the goal is to be awake. The goal is to be alive. And if the absurd is everywhere, then complete and full rebellion against it is better than a life that is only halfway rebelling against it, because it is through that the injustice of it all that we have the reason to go on anyways. Yeah. And so to like sort of speak on Scott's behalf, if you don't mind, in response to your response here. So what you said was that rebellion feels like an active thing. And I wonder if it, like, maybe, sure, I think that's totally consistent with what Camus' project in the Myth of Sisyphus is. But I think there's another way of reading it where it can be, rather than like an active, you're, loading up arms and pointing the guns down the range, a kind of more affective thing than effective, right? Which would be that, okay, so like Descartes' purpose in the Meditations is not to be like a skeptic and disprove everything, like method of doubt, but to prove science, to say like, look, God is consistent with doing science, because God is the reason that we have this natural light that when we think in the right way, we can, be justified in our scientific intuitions, right? So the goal though, is an inspired methodology rather than an end product. So Descartes in the Meditations isn't trying to prove anything. What he's trying to do is set up a conceptual foundation so that it's possible to prove things. And we might think that the Myth of Sisyphus is a similar kind of project. So rather than like actively rebelling, you might think that as long as you've done the thinking that Camus has done here, you're not going to kill yourself, and you're going to avoid philosophical suicide, and you're going to at least begin trying to rebel against the absurdity of things. And how this expresses itself is like the product that you produce through your own life and your own passions, which we might see next week. It's been like a month since I've read it, so I don't remember exactly how the form of the argument is. But the idea being that rebellion isn't the product, but the foundation upon which the product of a life can be developed. And in this sense, it's sort of affective, like the purpose of the Meditations, rather than effective, like say the purpose of the Communist Manifesto is supposed to be. There's nothing affective about the Communist Manifesto except that it inspires all sorts of anger and hatred for the bourgeoisie, and that you should go out and like raise arms and take your factories back. That's like declare war on the bourgeoisie. That's an like product of the philosophical method, rather than like an inspiration of an effective state that allows forms of life.
Glad it's that way, because I think I'd get annoyed if we had acolytes that were fighting against the absurd everywhere all the time. Probably get annoyed. So.
Yeah.
What do you think the relationship is between the self and others? in this idea of depleting oneself with one's passion. I'm interpreting it as being very self-directed, but with a sense of the only point of it is that you are somehow expressing your inner will or initiative. It's not as judged by anyone. It's not, I mean, I keep wondering, what is the relationship of the individual to the world in this format? Because you're not allowing others to determine your value or your meaning, and it's all inner directed as some kind of expression of will. And maybe you have a very purposeful life in a way because you're doing something, you're exhausting yourself in some purpose you've decided is somehow meaningful to you, although you must recognize there's no legacy, there's no maybe meaning to others, there's no external valuation of what you're doing. It's all internal. Am I getting this? Am I on track? Because I'm wondering about the relationship between the self and others, and this idea of depleting oneself with one's passion, and yet having a sense that I'm thinking that it's kind of a stoic kind of, we're all jars of clay, we're all going to break. It's there's no legacy, there's no sense of immortality, there's no sense of purpose. People will do with your contribution what they want, but it's still somehow meaningful to you to kind of cast it out there. Is that the idea of the absurd hero?
Yeah, I think you're on track. So these questions will all be answered. Well, I'll give answers to them next week. And I think it's an important question to ask. What is the like ethical relationship or political relationship, maybe however you interpret those words, that the absurd hero that Camus describes, what is that person's relationship to other people? And we get hints in his philosophy that are not so great, and then other hints in the way that he lived his actual life and the characters in his novels that are a little more heartening. So for instance, what he says, page 63, is where lucidity dominates, the scale of values becomes useless, which is to say that like our ethical systems are not helpful in the lucid awareness of the absurd. And so you might think, well, then it's possible to take advantage of people and do whatever and live hedonically. But I think that's a mistake, though not yet totally inconsistent with Camus' conception. And this like absurd hero in like the consequence of life with other people is not well, he deals a bit with it in The Rebel. So in The Rebel, the idea isn't the problem of suicide, it's the problem of murder, right? Why not kill other people? And so that gets dealt with a bit there. But on the whole, I think it's unclear how ethically, and I don't mean ethically like in the sense of like there is a sense of good that the person is consistent with, but like what, insofar as acting, they establish like an ethic of themselves, what the ethic of an absurd hero for Camus would look like, and if it would actually be a good thing. And this is again something that Beauvoir takes issue with in Camus, that there are worse ways to be lucidly awake to and in rebellion of the absurd than others.
Would you say that Gary Cooper in High Noon was somewhat of an absurd hero?
I haven't
Where
seen
you haven't? Oh, well, he defends a whole town based on who he is, and no one in the town stands up for him. They all abandon him. And at the end, it was Bill Clinton's favorite movie, which was interesting to me. And so they're all disloyal. They all sell him out. He risks his life. And then at the end, he just throws his like sheriff's badge in the dirt and rides off with Grace Kelly. But she's the only one who kind of comes to back him up. So, but the sense throughout the movie is that he is defending this town because of who he is, not who they are, because of his value system. It's very detached from, he can see that he's coming to his support. He can see that they aren't worth it, basically. But I keep wondering about the absurd hero's sense of values, and that it seems very self internalized, like the value isn't in that how others evaluate or value what you've done, but it's coming from the self, even if it's thrown away by others, that you do it because of who you are, kind of.
Yeah,
But I don't know if I'm making it right.
that's right. Right. So you wouldn't, as the absurd hero, you wouldn't, just as you wouldn't cow to the absurd, you wouldn't cow to some other's conception of you. You're not gonna, you know, say, "Oh no, they think I'm a bad person, and so I shouldn't be like that." No, it's that your own, your like self-willing is the important thing here. It's just making self-willing something that works well with other people's self-willing that's at issue, and there's no really direct solution in Camus to that problem, at least in this early Camus, the Myth of Sisyphus. So the character you're describing sounds a lot to me like most Western heroes, like Clint Eastwood and all of his films, but they're like Fistful of Dollars, Few Dollars More. And I would say, yeah, I think that Clint Eastwood's character, and maybe in High Noon too, that there is a consistency of self-willed, mildly hedonic, always aware of the absurdity of things way of living. But you got to wonder, like, if greed is ever taking a kind of leap in those characters too, or like coolness.
You know, this with Gary Cooper, there was no greed. You got to see that High Noon. But I like what you're saying, that it's the self-willing, that there's like basically an awareness, acceptance of the maybe corruption around you, or the fact that what you're contributing won't be maybe worth anything to anybody, but doing it based on your own self-will, your own, it's got to be self-directed, right? It's all from the self. And who knows where that comes from, and who knows why you choose to have this revolt instead of suicide. It's just something in you, right?
Well, it's an awareness of the absurd that inspires the revolt and indignation.
But you could just as easily inspire suicide, but something in you just turns it to the revolt instead of the suicide. I've just been wondering what makes the difference there between somebody choosing the revolt and becoming an absurd hero, or someone who just checks out, who is aware of the absurd but figures, well, it's not worth it.
It is the facing of the absurd that inspires this, says Camus. So according to his argument here, if you are lucidly aware of the absurd, then you get the three consequences, which is the revolt, the freedom, and the passion. That just happens. And we're at 7 o'clock, so let's call it. It's been 2 hours. So like I said at the beginning, I'll stick around. I'm going to stop the recording.